So good evening, bonsoir, guten Abend. As you know, my name is Karen Ragoonaden, and I'm presently the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba, and I'm on leave from the University of British Columbia. I am truly honored to be part of the fellowship program at the Eric Auerbach Institute for Advanced Studies, University of Köln. I would really like to thank my sponsor, Dr. Roman Bartosz, for his invitation. And I would also really like to recognize everybody there at the Institute who have made who though I was expected to be there in person, had to change plans, and really appreciate your thoughtfulness and commitment to making sure that this talk has gone through. So thank you. On another note, I also want to recognize the connections that was made through an international visiting student program via the participation of Roman's doctoral student, Zina Derschweiler. So Zina is here today, and she spent 6 months on my campus at UBC as a visiting doctoral student. I really want to recognize the importance of creating, of sustaining, of maintaining these really important international exchanges between visiting doctoral students, between professors, and where we come together collectively to share our experiences, to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn from one another. A second PowerPoint, please, Roman. Land acknowledgement. So I'd like to begin my talk by acknowledging that I'm situated on the unceded lands of the Syilx Okanagan's people. I identify as a settler, an immigrant woman living on these ancestral territories. I am 2 hours away from Kamloops, where Tecumloops Tishominwits First Nation announced the bodies of 215 children had been discovered buried near a former Kamloops residential school. So this school operated as a residential school from 1890 to 1969. And in April 2021 of this year, 215 bodies, and I know this made international headlines because I was talking to my colleagues in Germany about this. As I consider the unmarked graves of these children, I remember George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, Cooper Gate, Regis Courcincy-Paquette, Chantal Moore, Joyce Echaquan. Let's not forget these names, the people, and most of all, let's not forget children. Let's go beyond memory to discovery, to learning, to documentation, to action. That is the responsibility that lies within all of us. So coming back to this land acknowledgement, in Canada, it is now tradition to begin formal presentations with this land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement is in recognition of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that unearthed and summarized in a very concise manner the impact of residential schools and the intergenerational impact on First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. So as a settler woman, this land acknowledgement provides me with the time and space to reflect on my own sociocultural location here on the ancestral territories of the Syilx Okanagan's peoples, the people of Turtle Island. This is part of my own commitment, my own work to equity, diversity, inclusion, and within a Canadian context, decolonization, EDID. So equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. To a certain extent, I'm undertaking this work to advance the conversations and practices of EDID in the wake of decades of unsatisfactory initiatives aimed at deconstructing discrimination and systemic inequities in higher education. The slow progress of change has really generated widespread skepticism. And adding the term decolonization to EDI within my context is part of an ongoing process of unlearning, of uncovering, and transforming legacies of hegemony, as well as maximizing educational and knowledge systems available to relearn, to unlearn, to rebuild, in particular the social, cultural, and linguistic foundations that have erased, omitted, lost, or have been ignored through colonization. It is about making space for others, about making space for ourselves, about balancing, about generating and enabling diverse knowledge systems to thrive in the academy. Next PowerPoint. Roman, if you could move to PowerPoint 3. Thank you. So, as Roman mentioned, since this talk refers to literature as modeling mindful futures, I offer the following titles for your consideration as a paradigm for equitable and inclusive ways of being and doing. To begin with, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So, this is a 2019 nonfiction book by American author and historian Ibram X. Kendi. The book discusses concepts of racisms and Kendi's proposals for anti-racist individual actions and systemic changes. The next book, So You Want to Talk About Race, also a 2018 nonfiction book by Ijeoma Oluwo. Each chapter title is a question about race in contemporary America. Oluwo outlines her opinions on the topics as well as advice about how to talk about race, about gender, about class, and the various intersections that inform our identity. This book received positive critical reception with renewed interest following the May 2020 murder of George Floyd, after which the book re-entered into the New York Times bestseller list. The Skin We're In, a year of Black resistance and power. Desmond Cole writes with passion about anti-Black police violence in Canada, specifically Toronto, as well as the racism and xenophobia directed towards Indigenous folks and immigrants, people of color. His analysis is incisive and delves deep into the impacts of colonization. White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, is a 2018 book written by Robin DiAngelo about race relations in the US. Much of White Fragility is dedicated to pulling back the veil on ideologies about individualism, destiny, objectivity, the confidence that we have that we can free ourselves entirely from bias. And finally, the report of the TRC, The Truth and Reconciliation, summarized truly the tragic experiences of approximately 150,000 Canadian residential school students, some as young as 3. Many of these children were sexually and physically abused in the name of schooling, in the name of religion. Approximately 3,200 died of malnourishment, tuberculosis, and other diseases caused by poor living conditions. So coming back to the thesis of this talk, how does a humanist education supported by humanist literature influence well-being and resilience? How does it impact a consideration of a mindful future where a collective humanity is called upon together to solve societal inequities and issues? And I say we do this certainly through literature, we do this through humanist education, and we can do this through teacher education. We've seen collectively over the course of the last 2 years how we have managed to come together to create a vaccine to ward off the nefarious effects of COVID-19. And I know the roots of these vaccines were in BioNTech in Germany, and a collaboration, an international collaboration. Next PowerPoint, Roman, thank you. So as I consider my identity and my positionality within a context where critical literary discourse aims to engage the reader in activism towards a just and civil society, I'd like to share a little bit about myself. I identify as a brown, cisgendered, able-bodied woman whose roots are both from Eastern and Western contemplative practices. As part of my own cultural heritage, I've been practicing the ancient exercises of yoga, movement, breath, awareness from an early age. I'm also a qualified Kripalu yoga teacher and a certified mindfulness facilitator. And I have to admit, if academia had not worked out for me, my plan B was to be a yoga teacher. I'm presently the Dean of Education. I'm a professor. I'm the former director of the Center for Mindful Engagement. And the image you see is right outside my office at the UBC campus. So this is what we call our very own little mini Stonehenge. This is a circle where we gather outside to teach, to learn, to practice. And in this talk, as I said, what I'd like to talk about is really focus on what mindfulness is, definition of mindfulness, what is critical mindfulness, how do we incorporate well-being and resilience in humanist teacher education, and some practical applications of critical mindfulness in EDID contexts. Next PowerPoint, please. So this PowerPoint presentation, these definitions that are here are ones that I presented on Tuesday as well. There are 4 definitions more or less that arise when I consider, or I have considered, mindfulness in my own professional work. So not necessarily my personal experiences, but my professional work. So the first one I'll bring your attention is Langer's definition. She is a behavioral psychologist from Harvard. And according to her, mindfulness is a flexible state of mind involving the creation of new categories, an openness to new information, and an awareness of more than one perspective. Another definition that I adhere to is by Soloway, Poulin, and McKenzie. Something that happens to one's capacity. So mindfulness is something that happens to one's capacity to pay attention non-judgmentally to one's thoughts, feelings, and sensations, thus enabling a more skillful response to life's challenges. The third one from Australia, and now mindfulness is a natural human capacity which involves observing, participating, and accepting each of life's moments from a state of equilibrium or loving kindness. And that is a definition of wellness. And lastly, from John Kabat-Zinn, who is recognized as the father of Western secularized mindfulness, which came to light in the 1970s. Mindfulness is an awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment by moment. So let's just take a moment to just consider these 4 definitions. And simply notice which ones maybe you're more attuned to. And while we're doing that, Roman, if you don't mind, on to the next PowerPoint. So in my work, I tend to focus, professionally speaking, on Langer's definition of mindfulness, that is a flexible state of mind involving an awareness of more than one perspective. And in order to do this, I do come back to Kabat-Zinn's definition of awareness through attention in the present moment and non-judgment to the experience unfolding before us. Like others, I propose that developing an open and calm receptivity along with a realistic attitude about long-held opinions, assumptions, and biases towards the self and others can create supportive, calming, and non-reactive environments where capacities of unlearning and relearning are fostered in novel ways and where well-being and resilience can flourish. Next slide, please. So some of my colleagues describe teacher education, where I'm located, as preparing new teachers for the full catastrophe of 21st century. I would add that I would consider this for all of higher education, particularly in the humanities. While this is a play on words reminding us of Kabat-Zinn's book, The Full Catastrophe of Living, there is a grain of truth that is deeply embedded in this analogy, especially now as we're coming out of a pandemic, as we are dealing with a racial reckoning that has a global, that has been moved across our globe. We are really, all of us collectively, trying to find a sense of calmness in these times of uncertainty. So the simple act of slowing down, of pausing, of taking a breath, and bringing our focused attention to the present moment may offer a recipe, a respite for the news of the fearsome pandemic, the social and political instability, and ecological concerns. Here in British Columbia, we have just gone through a series of, mind-numbing floodings and torrential rains, which has cut off many of the interior towns from the Lower Mainland. And I know that this has been the case as well in Europe. We are all clearly feeling the need for timeout moments, for calm, for relaxation, and for present moment awareness in our day-to-day experiences. Accessible mindfulness practices could provide sustainable pathways to surviving this frantic world of the owner's second decade of the 21st century, where racial justice and anti-racist stances are at the forefront of our consciousness. Yet we know that these practices, these beneficial practices, are not available to all. And I urge us all, and this is part of my work, to consider who is engaging in these practices and who is not engaging in these practices. And this sort of has been part of the focus of my work over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So long before the arrival of the pandemic, long before the arrival of westernized secular approaches to mindfulness, educators have been exploring the use of contemplative practices to support and to nurture teacher and student well-being. 50 years of research in the area of mindfulness has given us reasons to incorporate these health-based practices. Very empirical, evidence-based research has demonstrated that these are beneficial and that they can be moved into different areas of higher education. Some of the benefits we've seen from mindfulness practices include a range of physiological and emotional benefits, overall well-being, and improvements in learning and memory ability. So while contemplative inquiry, like mindfulness practices, may seem to be relatively new in education in particular, we do know that these customs are integral features of several spiritual traditions. And some of the earliest references to meditation can be found in the Hindu tradition Yoga Sutra and in Buddhism, with its focus on seeking spiritual enlightenment. Despite the fact that the spiritual tenets of mindfulness are often overlooked, these practices of mindfulness have universal appeal, emphasizing the commonality of our spiritual customs and traditions of contemplation. For example, insight prayer in Christianity and smudging ceremonies in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Next slide, please. Critical mindfulness. So one of the things that has occurred over the course of the last 5 years about our criticisms about our contemporary focus on secular mindfulness practices. Critics state that the secularization of contemplative practices stray away from the moral principles and practices of social justice and engagement and reflection on everyday meanings. There's a strong call from many authors, philosophers, and practitioners to embed mindfulness within critical programs that not only help us heal in terms of well-being and stress reduction and stress management, but to create new ways towards personal development and universal social justice. Critical mindfulness in education is recognized as an opportunity to reorient education from narrowly conceived outcomes towards broader, ethically and socially engaged ones. Many authors in particular suggest that mindfulness programs should be embedded within critical programs that not only that create new ways towards personal development, but also comprehensive universal awareness. These practices can provide us a time and a space to learn about and to respond to social inequities and oppressive practices, and can also facilitate a deeper reflection and insights about social locations, about positionality, about race, gender, class, and the multitude of intersections which inform identity in societal systems. Within this call to recognize the moral principles of contemplative practices, the interdisciplinary nature of teaching, of learning, the humanities, combined with the ability to critically reflect on self and society, can provide a time and a space to learn about and to respond to societal inequities and oppressive practices. For example, in higher education, we already use critical first-person reflection and inquiry when discussing privilege and marginalization. This type of conscientisation, can provide foundational directions for equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. By cultivating tools for recognizing, observing, and understanding internal and external reactions to diverse realities, a number of colleagues like Barilla, Burak, Ergas, Forbes, and McGee propose that mindfulness practices can facilitate a deeper reflection and insights about social locations, positionality, race, class, ability, sexual orientations, and gender identities, like LGBTQ2S, and the multitude of intersections which inform us. Next slide, please. So critical mindfulness, critical first-person inquiry is not a new concept, but its application to mindfulness practices is. So critical first-person inquiry is the ability to experience something with an open mind and then step back and study the experience. This type of teaching and learning recognizes that learning is not merely intellectual, and knowledge is not something out there removed from our realities, but rather knowledge is representative of the historical, political, economic, social mores that inform how we live together within this, as Rousseau stated, the social contract. This skill is critical for courses that teach equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonizations. So courses like sociology, political science, and gender studies. These disciplines teach their subject matter not just as objects of study, but as social systems in which we all participate in various ways. So we need to see, study, question, examine, and act on the sources of stress using mindfulness, thinking about identity, thinking about wellness, thinking about resilience, within an anti-oppressive, inspired context of experiencing and working towards universal equality. Wilber calls this phase waking up. So not just practicing mindfulness for stress reduction, self-regulation, or to improve concentration, but as a part of inquiry into the nature of the self and an inquiry into the patterns of our minds in the context of a greater moral and social values. Interpreting how mindfulness is employed in society provides the possibility to critically reflect on who occupies the spaces in between and in betwixt, and who and why are in these liminal spaces. As our mindfulness practices lean towards universal compassion and loving kindness, mindfulness practitioners can move through egocentric to sociocentric moral development, reaching a stable awareness of unity consciousness or awakening. Wilber calls this growing up. From the inside educational communities, members can create mindful, healthy we spaces and relationships. These can be groups, even campuses as a whole, that empower and foster support, trust, safety, respect, inclusiveness, caring, compassion, healing, and connectedness to everybody. We can engage in mindful practices that explore issues relating to EDID, such as racism and privilege between community members. And this is called working on relationships and showing up. So positioning mindfulness as a disposition could study, uncover, and challenge hidden implicit cultural biases, assumptions, attachments, practices, and rituals, and even curriculum. We could examine the cultural constructions of meanings in schools and in education, individualism, materialism, consumerism, ethnocentrism, racism, privilege, sexism, homophobia, colonialism, and even contemplative education itself, even mindfulness. We could reflect on what kind of educational culture we have, what kind of moral culture do we want, and how do we change this? And Forbes calls this wising up. In this way, by wising up, we could also act up by engaging in mindful social action for social justice, working together and developing alliances across class, race, identity, our multitude of intersections that inform our realities, creating healthy, more inclusive, socially just policies and systems that demand universal quality education for all and realities for all. As Forbes states in his analogies of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up, wising up, and acting up, we can make healthy use of findings from neuroscience to move away from a paradigm where we focus on wellness and well-being, towards becoming a morally wise person involved in the context of healthy, caring, and equitable educational values. Next slide, please. So as a point of interest, we can move towards more practical applications. How do we incorporate mindfulness in EDI contexts and humanist teaching in teacher education? And I begin by saying that Kabat-Zinn identified 7 frequently cited attributes of mindfulness, and they are non-judgment, patience, beginner's mind, trust, non-striving, acceptance, and letting go. If we relate this to the literature, we'll see that some of these attributes are related to Schoen's conceptualization of reflective practice, and Dewey's connecting practices of awareness, reflection, and dialogue, and supporting democratic citizenship and social arrangements. Burrows from Australia explores how mindfulness practices support critical reflection as an opening for new ways of observing and understanding diversity in contemporary schooling. For example, if we were to draw parallels with anti-racist education's focus on understanding the economic, structural, and historical roots of inequality, we can explore how mindfulness practices can support the multiple cries decrying systemic racism and violence. As Kendi pushes us to talk about race and anti-racism, he encourages us to become aware of our own biases and our own assumptions. He also recognizes that we have been socialized to not talk about race as if it is a taboo subject. Kendi encourages each and every one of us to go beyond this and to embrace these complicated conversations. And this, to a certain extent, is sort of the nexus of my considerations as I'm moving forward with my research, my teaching, and my service. Next slide, please. So along those same lines, Owen Smith contends that mindfulness practices in higher education can sustain students as they reflect on how their identity, locations, and intersections shape their reactions to the diversity of society. Taking time to be present and to consider long-held beliefs and assumptions can provide opportunities to question and to reflect on implicit practices relating to identity, to privilege, to marginalization. We know that 50 years of research has demonstrated that mindfulness practices support the cultivations of focus, of presence, of emotional resilience, and also self-reflection. We also know that Barilla refers to this focus on self-reflection as critical first-person inquiry. The latter cultivates the ability to engage with experience based on an open mind and then ask to step back and study the experience. Next slide, please. So responding to the identifying foci in literature, my research and teaching consider how to support pre-service and service teachers in the acquisition and development of knowledge, dispositions, and skills to negotiate learning environments relating to race, culture, gender, and the multiple intersections of identity. Using critical first-person inquiry, our objectives are to explore the impact of introducing mindfulness practices to diversity courses, which focus on EDID, and then to advance the intersections, overlaps, and distinctions in the dynamics of privilege and marginalization. Next step, please. This is just an example of some informal and formal practices. When I presented to the doctoral students last week, I shared a curriculum that we developed called Stress Management and Resiliency Techniques. And part of it is it's a 20-hour course that looks at how we engage in mindfulness. The first thing we do are informal practices. So usually informal practices are just bringing your focus and attention to a day-to-day activity, whether it's walking, washing your dishes, making your bed, maybe it's going for a run, biking, hiking. And then the more formal practices, which require, I would say, the guidance of a trained facilitator. So visualizations, body scans, and meditations. Next slide, please. So just a word of caution, recognizing that when we introduce mindfulness practices into contexts where we are discussing EDI, we have to be really aware that many responses can emerge, particularly from students whose voices have been historically marginalized. So appreciating the focus on self-reflection can intentionally trigger intense reactions. So for example, asking a student, to consider an incident where racism occurred, for example, or ostracization or marginalization, and to look at that issue or that context or that experience in a non-judgmental way can often be very traumatic. So these discussions have to be approached very carefully. So the relationship between the instructor, for example, and the students is very important. Creating safe spaces where voices are respected, and where there's recognition of the impact, the traumatic impact of these experiences. So So while contemplative practices can provide compassionate ways of sitting and potentially healing, there's also a long way to go in terms of how we deal and we debrief and we deconstruct these experiences together as a community. So I will then go on to the next slide, please. So we do know that there are challenges, as much as this talk is about using mindfulness to develop wellness and well-being. There are a lot of challenges that still have to be dealt with. And I just identified some of the challenges when and how to introduce these contemplations or these mindfulness practices, how to integrate them into traditional interdisciplinary courses, for example, and not just as an aside, how to maintain safety, and how much instructor experience, knowledge, and skill are needed. And for those of you who are interested, I really follow the work of Charles Burak, Beth Barilla, Rhonda McGee, who have really provided very contemporary, over the course of the last 5 years, instructions and shared plans and how they do that within their own coursework. And I'll just move on to the next slide, please. I also want to recognize the traditional spiritual practices that are present here in North America. Here, there are two very different models that have influenced secular mindful practices, traditional spiritual practices from Eastern meditative customs like Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism, as well as the behavioral approaches developed by psychologist Alan Langer about the flexible state of mind, and of course, Kabat-Zinn with a focus on stress management and resiliency. Next slide, please. And from Australia, I tend to refer to a lot of Australian, colleagues. Like Auerbach and Cohen, and in particular Burroughs here, who talks about or proposes that mindfulness can be practiced as parts of one's professional way of being. They've termed this relational mindfulness, and it's an approach which invites us to listen to ourselves, to the other, and that relational field between the self and the other. So they consider relational mindfulness to be a deepening awareness of the present relational experience within professional contexts, where acceptance, where connection is described at the core of psychological well-being. So this is just a consideration as we're moving forward. And our last slide, resetting our minds. So to conclude, I'd like to refer back to the informal and informal mindfulness practices as ways in which to frame emotions and reactions, learning to sit with them and to develop thoughtful responses to EDID. Understanding the complexities of integrating mindfulness practices in higher education, I refer back to the modeling provided by humanist authors like Kendi, D'Angelo, Cole, and Maynard. I recognize the main challenges of introducing well-being practices steeped in spiritual traditions in secular higher educations. But we need to realize that the literature is awash with criticisms aimed at these secular approaches with a focus to self-reflection and self-improvement to the detriment of the moral values and betterment of society. I think that introducing mindfulness practices in higher education are complex engagements where a fulsome awareness of the historical and spiritual tenets of these traditions are necessary. A general knowledge, I would say developing an open and calm receptivity to create supportive, calming, and non-reactive environments is important, especially when we deal with issues relating to race, to gender, to class, and multiple intersections of our identity. I would also agree as a facilitator leading or an instructor leading these practices that a general knowledge of psychotherapy, including Western counseling skills, would be an asset, especially to avoid the reawakening of traumatic memories. And I think in particular, when we consider how mindfulness, wellness, resilience can be married with EDI in higher institutions, that it is up to us to create culturally safe spaces where all students, regardless of their social locations, can reflect and discuss on the multiplicity of these intersections. And that this is an effort, it's going to take an effort on all our parts, higher institutions, policies, practices, administrations, and professors to consider these contexts. And I truly understand that this is a question of trust and respect. Alvin Toffler speaks to the significance of the 21st century learners and educators of unleashing their own capacity to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn. And so new learning such as this, along with the use of critical first-person inquiry to reflect on inequities in our society, provides a means to think about, to understand, and possibly to progress towards a just and civil future for all. We all possess the human capacity for observation, for participation, and acceptance of life's moments from a loving, compassionate stance. And the challenge for individuals is to embody and to apply these precepts in a sustainable manner in our daily lives. We have all heard the call for contemplated traditions of the East and West to support social justice. And if we adhere to this call, it may be time to shed attachment to the self in favor of universal compassion, to challenge our society's focus on self-centeredness, its individualism, materialism, and the status quo of inequitable power and privilege. An approach based on critical first-person inquiry situates a mindful future where literary discourse can promote conceptualizations of well-being, of resilience, where the focus on inner awareness and outer awareness can support a move away from the focus on the self, where equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization can prevail. If that's the case, I urge us all to move toward that mindful future, especially now as we grapple with a pandemic which has sought to isolate us, forcing us to negotiate the multiple realities within of our identity and our positionality through technology. Let's all move towards a mindful disposition where we're attuned to the world within us and the world outside us. I'll just end with my references, Roman, and then we can stop the PowerPoint.